The question of betrayal. Luke 22 verses 21 to 33. Here we discover something very interesting. Luke felt a need to reverse the order that is found in Mark. In Mark 14:17 to 21, we are told that Jesus is to be betrayed by one of the disciples before the actual event itself, although no name is mentioned. In Luke, this dialogue about the betrayal takes place after the meal, which again means that the Judas participated in the meal. Why does Luke do this? Why does Luke omit details that are so important to Matthew and Mark? Firstly, Luke portrays the scene in such a way that the problem of treason becomes an issue for all of the disciples. The disciples confront one another as they question each other's loyalty. Luke then leaves the matter there. The betrayer is one whose, quote, Lord, unquote, is with one at the table, in verse 21. Who is it? Judas? All of them at the table? Judas, the disciples, and the church? Secondly, Luke issues the warning since he wants the congregation to engage in self-examination. They dare not rely upon a fake security. Even those who participate in the Lord's Supper are not safe from the lapse of faith, from faltering in their following, and indeed even abandoning their loyalty to the Master. So the warning does not fall into faithlessness, which then will lead to the danger of becoming traitors of the Lord and his kingdom. Woe to the betrayer, in verse 22. Therefore, examine yourselves. Once again, we are confronted by Luke's actualization of the ministry of Jesus, quote, the Lord, unquote, verse 21. Whose Lord? According to Luke, anyone would be his Lord. Note the indefinite anyone. One who comes to the Lord's table, anyone who comes to the Lord's table, which includes the church. Anyone who reads this account, no matter what time and place. The warning is therefore to us as we come to the Lord's table. We are part of the anyone. The new meaning of service in 22:24 to 27. Luke confronts the reader with his actualization or immediacy of the event with the opening words, quote, they began to quarrel amongst themselves, unquote. Who? Who quarreled? Not just the 12, but includes the church, since this age-old question arises in congregation from generation to generation. Quote, who is the greatest among us? Here Luke's account is unique. St. Matthew and Mark, in Mark 10, raises this question with reference to the sons of Zebedee. Luke had reported this earlier, but now he grafts it into the Lord's Supper account. Once again, we see how Luke recasts the Markan account. In Mark 10:45, the climax is, quote, for the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. But in Luke, the climax is recast and now reads in verse 27, quote, but I am among you as one who serves, unquote. As one who serves. In the Lucan Lord's Supper itself, Jesus does not appear as servant, but actually acts as the one who presides over the meal, especially when compared to John 13, where he washes their feet. The servant of Jesus has an entirely new scope and meaning for Luke. Here again we see Luke applying what Jesus says to the church, that is, making it actual and real in the church to his liturgical practice. When we look more closely how Luke altered the Markan account, we see that he has substituted certain words in Mark by words taken out of the life of the congregation, making the event more concrete as compared to Mark's more general approach. This is seen especially in the introduction of the term diakone, to act, to serve. In the life of the church, the one who serves is pictured in terms of the congregation gathered together to celebrate the Lord's Supper. This is liturgical connotations, as the community confesses its faith in his Lord as the one who is present in their midst and as one who serves them. He serves as Lord, but not as the kings of the Gentiles exercise their lordship, not in terms of brutality, but now as benefactors. Jesus sits down at the table with the gifts, and those who participate under his rule as king are the benefactors. This is not the way society understands status and rank. Unlike in society, a fishing at the Lord's table, ranking is related to service and not to place. Note again how Luke attempts to actualize the event, quote, "but so with you," unquote, in verse 26, and, quote, "among you," unquote, verse 26. But I'm among you as one who serves. There's also the promise in verse 28 to 30. Here Luke witnesses again to the real presence of Christ in the church. The solemn assurance in verse 22, chapter 22, verses 28 to 30. Quote, "You are those who have continued with me in my trials," unquote, verse 28. That is, they have remained faithful, they've remained loyal and not betrayed Jesus, in verse 23. Who are the hearers of this statement? If it is the risen Lord who is speaking, note the tense of the verb, then the trials are not only historical events, the trials are the difficulties of Jesus which he has had to endure as head of the church, but which he is still as head of the church, and his church now endures with him as its head. The trials of the church in its life and experience. Once again, Luke manages to actualize the accounting of having the risen Lord speak to his church. These are the Lord's words to the celebrating congregation, the words of the king as one who rules the kingdom in verse 17. Historically, we know that the disciples did not remain with Jesus in his trial. They fled, and therefore, by implication, Jesus must be speaking to the Christian church. To those who remain faithful during the trials, he gives his solemn assurance in verse 28 that they will share in his rule, verse 29. Not only will they share in his rule of his messianic kingdom, but the promise is that they will attend the messianic banquet. And finally, they have the promise that they will be with the Lord, quote, "eat and drink at my table in my kingdom," in verse 30. The church receives this twofold promise from the risen Lord as his solemn assurance, his solemn word, his solemn oath, based upon God's solemn oath and word to Jesus, that those who remain faithful will be A, rule with Christ, B, celebrate the Messianic feast with the Lord. The church already has a foretaste of this feast in the Lord's Supper, but will participate fully when he comes to rule. Analysis of the forewarning in 22, 31 to 38. The source of strength, verse 31 to 34. Here again, Luke actualizes this account. He detaches it from the Markan setting, which is set on the way to Gethsemane, and gives the event a timeless character. Simon, verse 34, does not limit it to Simon alone, but implies a larger audience, for it is for all Simons of all ages, which is included by the plural you in verse 21. He gives the warning that Satan is, quote, sifting, unquote, verse 31. Sifting, which equals severe trials of faith. The followers of Jesus, the Christ, are experiencing trials, some hard realities, and many troubles. They wrestle with temptation, vexation, and despair. All the church, not only the disciples, are included, but this is a somber prelude to the real theme. The cardinal idea Luke has added with particular emphasis, quote, "but I have prayed for you," in verse 32. Satan may have a free hand in sifting, but listen to the good news. We have an advocate in Jesus the Christ. We are not alone. Jesus is with his church. We are not powerless, for Jesus is the source of strength, in verse 32. Quote, "but I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail," unquote. The strength that Jesus offers his church is one that we do not have in ourselves, namely to maintain our faith. We are constantly aware of the possible failure of our faith, that we, or like Peter, can betray our Lord, but the danger of failure of faith can be overcome. How? Only through the unfailing presence of Jesus the Christ. Everything is dependent upon him. He alone. Like Peter, we whose faith has failed because of temptation can, through our Lord's solicitude and care, quote, "turn again," unquote. Through the experience of the Lord's care and intervention in our lives, we can, quote, strengthen your brethren, unquote, in verse 32. What Christ has done for Peter, he will do for all the weak. His boundless solicitude, his unfailing presence, quote, I am as one among you, as the one who serves, unquote, verse 27. He intercedes for us so that we may not lose faith. He sustains us by his daily presence and continual unfailing care. Here we see Luke's actualization of the real presence of Christ once again. The concluding exhortation. Once again, we see Luke actualizing the real presence of Christ in its unique way for the church. In verse 35, he refers to the sending out of the disciples in 9:3, and how they are sent out in simple faith, putting their trust in the Lord and his word. They lacked nothing in verse 35, for the people received them and cared for their needs. But that peaceful time has now ended. The time that they had enjoyed with their master is now over and in the past. The storm is at hand, quote, but now, unquote. Present time. Time of the church is different, but now their own people have become hostile. But now their hearts are hardened. But now their eyes are closed. Troubles have erupted, and the Christians are struggling heavily in battle. Their daily experience is not as before that all their needs are met, but now rather it is more like that of their master and his suffering in verse 37, as they follow him and take his role of the suffering servant based on Isaiah 53:12. Now all those who follow Jesus must go down the same path on which he has traveled. Now Christ's followers face a drastically new situation and hold a different vision to that of the first disciples who were sent out. Now they must make provision, verse 36, and rely upon themselves. Now there is the command of the Lord of the church that he who has no sword to sell his mantle and buy a sword, in verse 36. This reference to a sword is used metaphorically in early church as a synonym for courage. They need courage to face trials and the tribulations. Thus there is the injunction of our Lord to have courage, to be brave in our witnessing for Christ in the midst of conflict and strife.